Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Nada Hayed, and I am the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the Cooper Union. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2024 Science and Literature Ceremony. I want to begin by acknowledging that our location here at the Cooper Union is the unceded territory of the Lenape, a people who have stewarded this land for many generations. We acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonization on Indigenous people and that the devastating effects of their forced displacement have largely been understudied and overlooked. As an institution of higher education, we acknowledge that the standard curriculum has erased countless voices and violent truths. We affirm the possibility of return for Indigenous communities, and we acknowledge that our current and future students are all worthy of the struggle for equality and justice. For those of you who might be new to the Cooper Union, Cooper is among the nation's leading colleges for students pursuing degrees in art, architecture, and engineering. From its founding in 1859, this institution has advanced the principle that free access to both education and forums for public discourse is imperative to a democratic society. Cooper's educational commitment is also rooted in fostering creative work at the intersection of scientific knowledge and humanistic inquiry. Tonight, we honor an extraordinary group of authors who show us where that generative union of imagination and scientific literacy can lead. We are so excited to be hosting tonight's program with these highly original and inspiring voices. I want to thank the National Book Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation for presenting tonight's program and partnering with us to make this year's Science and Literature Ceremony possible. My thanks also to Housing Works, an organization dedicated to providing critical services and advocacy to end HIV, AIDS, and homelessness. They're here selling books by tonight's featured authors, so please remember to pick up your copies. Now, to get the evening underway, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ruth Dickey, the Executive Director of the National Book Foundation. For more than 25 years, Ruth has worked to champion literary programs, community building, and the arts. Please join me in welcoming Ruth.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Dean Ayad, for that very warm welcome. Tonight, we are celebrating the third exciting year of Science and Literature, a National Book Foundation program that highlights exceptional writing across genres in science and technology, made possible by the tremendous support of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Later this year, we're celebrating the 75th National Book Awards on November 20th. Anniversary years are strange and special creatures, an opportunity to slow down and speed up, simultaneously thinking about the past, the present, and the future. As we explore treasures from our archives across the year, it felt apt that the timeliness and significance of science and literature to our work is not new. At the third National Book Awards in 1952, Rachel Carson accepted the National Book Award for Nonfiction for her book, The Sea Around Us, and said, quote, "The aim of science is to discover and illuminate truth, and that, I take it, is the aim of literature, whether biography or history or fiction. If there is poetry in my book about the sea, it is not because I deliberately put it there, but because no one could write truthfully about the sea and leave out the poetry." I'm so grateful to the Sloan Foundation as our partners in expanding what one might expect when they hear science and technology writing. Most especially Vice President and Program Director Doran Weber, a fellow writer and reader who has funded hundreds of authors over the last decade through the Sloan Book Program. Many, many thanks to Doran, who you will get to meet in just a moment, as well as to Shreya Bindwale, and the National Book Foundation's board, staff, and interns, especially Emily Lovett and Natalie Green, Kim Newman and the Cooper Union, the team at Really Useful Media, and Erica Pratico and Cheryl Grimm from Housing Works, our partners in selling books tonight. We would not be gathered if not for the efforts of the extraordinary 2024 Science and Literature Selection Committee, a group of writers, scientists, and science communicators who we are deeply indebted to. Thank you to Shane Campbell-Staton, Priya Natarajan, Ricardo Nuila, Brian Tier, and Christina Vizcarra. Thank you all so much for your time, care, and elevation of 3 beautiful books for us all to read and learn from. Please join me in giving our committee a round of applause. Our intrepid committee chair, Ricardo, will be the one to introduce you to these brilliant books, but my thanks and gratitude to Brad Fox, Arthur Z., and Navuyo Rosa Chuma for their work and for joining us tonight. How lucky we are to get to celebrate you and your books. And many, many thanks to Ebony Rabateau, who is joining us in the midst of her own book tour for Lessons for Survival, for taking the time to host this evening's event. We're grateful to all of you for being with us tonight in person and online, and we hope that you might sign up for our newsletter to follow along with our upcoming events across the country, our 75th anniversary plans, and so much more at nationalbook.org. And without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Doran Weber, Vice President and Program Director at the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Thank you for coming to our 3rd now annual Science and Literature Prizes. For those of you who don't know, the Sloan Foundation, we're a New York-based philanthropy founded in 1934 and make grants for research and education in science, technology, and economics. And tonight's program is part of our program in the public understanding of science and technology, and I'm now going to show you a brief video to give you a picture of what we do. Can you please roll?
Our universe began with a bang. Then Earth formed, and life came. 3 billion years later, that life would lead to humanity. Humans developed tools and trade. They painted cave walls and told stories around a fire. This was the beginning of both science and art, of civilization. Science and technology enabled us to understand nature and to build on it. Art and the humanities allowed us to express our deepest feelings and thoughts. They were 2 sides of the same human impulse to survive and thrive. But as art advanced and science became more powerful and specialized, the 2 cultures diverged. This polarization continues to pose a fundamental challenge to modern progress. For more than 2 decades, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Program in Public Understanding of Science and Technology has worked to bridge the divide between these 2 cultures. We bring science and the humanities together by empowering creators, writers, directors, playwrights, and others to tell stories that inspire appreciation for scientific discovery and its multifaceted human dimension. Sloan has supported thousands of books, screenplays, films, radio segments, TV shows, plays, and various media from operas to virtual reality that make science more accessible and showcase the pioneering human stories of scientists and scientific achievement that have shaped the modern world. Sloan's exceptional grantees demonstrate what's possible when scientists and artists come together. They dramatize tales of great breakthroughs and tragic failures, as well as the benefits and costs of such endeavors. Their stories promote progress in human knowledge, inspire the next generation, and spotlight the people often left out of the history books. Because before Neil Armstrong could take his giant leap onto the moon, there was a young woman in Virginia who did the math to put him there. As civilization continues to advance, we'll need both scientists and artists to speak a common language and meet new challenges together. Because science is a primary engine of human progress. It touches every part of life on this planet. from our food and water to our climate and health. And it results from human curiosity, benevolence, and ambition. Now, more than ever, we must support artists with a moral, human-centered imagination to portray the complex and far-reaching role of science and scientists in the world, so that we may apply the deepest and most fundamental human knowledge for the betterment of all.
Thank you. So as you can see from that, we're a kind of a nonprofit multimedia company for science. I want to mention two other non-book items. One, yesterday, American Experience, PBS, one of our longstanding partners, had a show called The Cancer Detectives, the trailblazers who landed the first blow against cancer, which is essentially about the development of the cervical cancer screening test, otherwise known as the Pap smear, and how that saved. That was the leading cause of death for women at the time, and what an advance that was. And then a week later, at the Ensemble Studio Theater, one of our flagship theater partners, we have a play called Boris Kenyas, which is about the development of the birth control pill, but seen from the point of view of the women in Puerto Rico who were part of the mass trials, and the ambivalence, because it was obviously, the pill was very empowering for women, but the early tests involved, the dosages were too high and there was some casualties, so it delves into some of those issues. So back to our book program, as you see there, we've been doing books for over a quarter century. Over 200 books have been published, some of them well-known, like Hidden Figures. One other one I'm going to mention just because it's timely this year. It's called American Prometheus. It was published in 2005. About Oppenheimer. It became the basis of the film that won 7 Oscars and I think earned over $1 billion. So sometimes science books are really make it big, but even when they don't, we support important subjects that are not going to reach a mass audience. This year we just took an ad in the New York Review of Books saluting the 11 published authors from this year's book grants. We make about 15, 20 book grants a year. And this particular award with the National Book Foundation was was an effort to diversify both the stories we tell and the people who tell those stories, looking for excellence and diversity in science writing. And it was also our first foray, even though we support screenplays and theater and all of that, to actually give awards, recognize poetry and fiction. So we're making history that way. And then finally, before we hand over to our winners tonight, I just want to say Sloan Foundation has a very good record in picking winners. One of our best-known signature programs called Sloan Research Fellowships is given to scientists early in their career. They get 2 years to work on what they want. And of the people that have won those awards, 57 have gone on to win the Nobel Prize. So it bodes very well. So without further ado, let me again thank Ruth Dickey, Natalie Green, everybody at the National Book Foundation. Thank you to Cooper Union for hosting us. Thank you to our jurors. Congratulations, of course, to our 3 amazing winners. Thank you to Emily Rabateau for hosting tonight. And I think I'm handing it over to Ricardo Nuila, one of our head of the jury. Thank you.
On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank the National Book Foundation for giving us this wonderful opportunity to select 3 literary works that illuminate the beauty of science and that convey its importance and vitality to the public. I don't want to make anyone jealous or anything, but this was a rare treat. How could it not be? For a period of 2 weeks in September, I received on average 4 books a day, each delivery leaving my kids just a little bit more crestfallen. It's for daddy again, they would say. My fellow committee members are working scientists and poets, which meant that our discussions touched upon everything from how one would actually look at the Orion Nebula telescopically to what the word remarkable means. I'm proud to say that we never took our discussions too lightly or too seriously either. It feels a bit like a dream that our opinions are being promulgated by the National Book Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to people throughout the country and world. Thank you for this program and for trusting us with the task. A question that occasionally popped into my head during the process was, why science and literature? What's so special about this combination? One of my heroes, Anton Chekhov, wrote that science and literature both seek the truth and the meaning of life. They seek God and the soul. The works we've selected embrace the mysteries Dr. Chekhov alludes to while grounding readers in our shared scaly world. That's their grace. Beyond aim, both science and literature share a method. The process of observing, followed by researching, to generate conclusions that are tested and analyzed and tested again before being published, inhabits the Wikipedia page for the scientific method. But are these not the same steps a writer takes, except with the use of language? The historian Jacques Barzun, in one of my all-time favorite passages, describes how the most lucid writing casts a spell on its readers, luring them into thinking that this rollout of ideas and dramas is how, naturally, we all think. But it is not natural, Barzun writes. It is the product of extreme self-consciousness, as in Descartes' method. The good sentence is the clockwork put back together again after careful analysis. Good sentences, good stanzas, good experiments, supernatural efforts that make it all look easy. The crazy thing is that in both literature and science, when that method is performed masterfully, in the right conditions, under the right context, what takes place is alchemy. The individual becomes universal. You drop enough iron balls from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, you paint a person or a moment uniquely enough, you reach beyond your own body, you uncover the laws and emotions and truths that govern us all. The leap from the specific to the general might be what I love most about literature and science. It helps me understand the world better. We, the committee, applaud the awardees tonight for their meticulous clockwork and for helping us see the world more generally through our individual eyes. And so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the three books selected by the committee. Part Jules Verne type adventure, part social inquiry, the bathysphere book, Effects of the Luminous Ocean Depths by Brad Fox, chronicles the descent of a self-taught scientist and explorer into the oceanic abyss, where he discovers never-before-seen species as well as truths about our senses, all within a 4.5-foot steel sphere. Fox complicates the trope of the lone white male scientific genius while illuminating the human drive to explore. Spanning 50 years and 11 books, The Glass Constellation confirms Arthur Z's reputation as a contemporary master. It also offers readers an overview of his unique approach to science writing. Z is a cosmologist whose poems blend Chinese, Buddhist, American indigenous, and Western scientific worldviews to produce meditations on simultaneity and the intricately patterned fabric of the real. Digging Stars by Novuyo Rosa Chuma spans generations and continents to tell the intensely personal story of an astrophysicist navigating grief, mental health challenges, and the politics of practicing science. Chuma asks fundamental questions about the scientific enterprise and eschews simple answers, instead revealing an underlying complexity deeply entwined with the social context in which science is practiced. Without further ado, I'll welcome our honorees, Brad Fox, Arthur Z, and Novuyo Rosa Chuma, alongside our brilliant host, author Emily Rabateau, to the stage. Thank you.
We're going to start with hearing a little bit of everybody's work. We're going to start with short readings. And Brad, you're up first.
Should I go to the, I think maybe I'll stand up. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So, first of all, just briefly, thank you so much. This is such a thrill. It was such an amazing surprise out of nowhere to get that phone call that announced this award. And so thank you to the National Book Foundation, the jury, the Sloan Foundation, and Ben Schrank at Astra, and everybody who made my book happen, Akin Akinwumi, my agent. So just, those are, I have to say. Okay, so the Bathysphere book is about the first deep ocean dives, and the lead scientist in the expedition is a guy named William Beebe, and so that is the Beebe that's being referred to in this excerpt. It's a short, the book is short chapters. This is called Across the Looking Glass. Beebe begins his book about the bathysphere dives, half mile down, by describing several shallow dives over the course of delightful days and afternoons, wandering a few fathoms below the surface. Seawater is our original home, he says. We can feel it in the lightness and grace when we move through it, effortlessly letting go. But to enter the sea now is not a return to an eternal past. The sea has a history just as we do, measured in part by its saltiness. The oceans were once fresh and became saltier as minerals from shorelines and living creatures dissolve. So even though constantly sweetened by rains and rivers, Beebe says, today the ocean is very slightly saltier than it was yesterday. While sea creatures' systems are open, freely exchanging with the environment as water flows through them, ours are not. Seawater is now 3 times as salty as our bodies, so we're not returning to our ancestral home, but to a new place where things have moved on without us. It requires all our ingenuity to sink back in. But unlike on land, Beebe points out, nothing that moves fears us, so we are made to feel at home. Crossing the reflective surface, everything is different. What you saw above, a flat surface like the moon, becomes a living organism of brilliant colors and delicate shapes, unimaginable from the other side. At first he was content to submerge himself a few feet, then a few fathoms, but even these brief submersions changed the world and his place in it. I knew that I had added thousands upon thousands of wonderful miles to my possible joy of earthly life. Once he rids himself of fears, of sharks and octopuses and barracudas, all the things conjured to terrify children, he is free. Tellingly, he calls this new habitat a newly conquered realm, conquest being nothing more than a perch from which to observe in relative comfort. But after you have made a dozen descents, he says, you will wish to do something more than stand amazed. And here he composes a litany of bourgeois delights that can be enjoyed undersea. Write on waterproof paper, shoot film, paint with oils while politely brushing aside little fish, or shoot what particular fish you wish with barbed arrows of brass wire, though he, an old hand, now prefers dynamite. The denizen of the kingdom of the helmet may also engage in gardening. Choose some beautiful slope or reef grotto and with a hatchet chop and pry off coral boulders and waving purple sea plumes and golden sea fans and great party-colored anemones. These dispatches to his readers were as exotic as life with robots and flying saucers, and his familiarity with them was the mark of his achievement. It was one thing to get there, it was another thing to be no longer struck by it. He knows he is accustomed to the subaquatic world, he says, when he no longer thinks of water as wet. He had been in such a state some years ago, floating in his helmet in a bay in Haiti, comfortably gazing at the reef and the coral and countless colorful creatures, when he came to the edge of a drop-off. His luxury slipped away as he looked into the deep water, felt the darkness pulling him in, and realized his destiny was down. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
What a pleasure to be here this evening, and I also want to thank the jury and everyone at the National Book Foundation and Sloan Foundation for promoting science and literature and bringing us all together. What a pleasure and honor. And I also want to thank everyone at Copper Canyon Press who has believed in my work and published my poetry for many years. I'm going to read 2 short poems. The first one is called Doppler Effect. Stopped in cars, we are waiting to accelerate along different trajectories. I catch the rising pitch of a train. Today, 109 people died in a stampede converging at a bridge. Radioactive water trickles underground toward the Pacific Ocean. Nickel and copper particulates contaminate the Brocade River. Will this planet sustain 10 billion people? Switch it. A spider plant leans toward a glass door, and 6 offshoots dangle from it. The more I fingered the clay slab into a bowl, the more misshapen it became. Though I have botched this, bungled that, the errancies reveal it would not be better if things happened just as I wished. A pufferfish inflates on deck. A burst of burnt rubber rises from pavement. Transpirations. Leafing branches of a backyard plum. Branches of water on a dissolving ice sheet. Chatter of magpies when you approach. Lilacs lean over the road weighted with purple blossoms. Then the noon sun shimmers the grasses. You ride the surge into summer. Smell of pinon crackling in the fireplace. Blued notes of a saxophone in the air. Not by sand running through an hourglass, but by our bodies igniting. Passing in the form of vapors from a living body. This world of orange sunlight and wildfire haze. World of iron filings pulled toward magnetic south and north. Pool of quicksilver when you bend to tie your shoes. Standing, you well up with glistening eyes. Have you lived with utmost care? Have you articulated emotions like the edges of leaves? Adjusting your breath to the seasonal rhythm of grasses? Gazing into a lake on a salt flat and drinking in reflection the Milky Way. Thank you.
Hello. It's really such a pleasure to be here. And thank you to my publisher, Norton, for their unwavering support throughout the publication process. Thank you to my partner, Alexia Arthurs, herself a brilliant writer who read many a draft and honed the language to become what it was. And thank you to the National Book Foundation and the Sloan Foundation. I think receiving this call was so, for me, life-changing. You write something and then you really wonder, did I write it? I'm originally from Zimbabwe, and usually, as an African writer, you're seen as writing about myth or folklore. But I understood myself as writing about science, so to have others confirm that is actually a really big deal. So I'm going to read an excerpt now from Digging Stars. My father shared his paper on Bantu geometries one morning during breakfast. He began by sharing the memory of communing with the digging stars as a child, tracking their trajectory across the sky with the help of the lone marula tree on the flat savanna horizon. He never tired of observing the cosmic dance between the digging stars and the Umtala, the Milky Way, the stars shadowing the crescent arc of the sugar-crusted galaxy, like children trailing their mother. Those nights spent stargazing were a lesson in patience, in the art of attunement. He felt a deep, satisfactory accomplishment in learning to read the smallest deviation in the sky's movements, noting the fine-tuned corresponding screech of the cicadas or the anomalous flurry of the bats. He knew when it was time to prepare the fields for the planting season just by looking up at the night sky and listening during the day to the stringent tweets of the Kalahari robin and by sniffing the ambrosial scent of the red marula flowers. What was time but a river sparkling across a lapis lazuli sky, sucking you into its bottomless currents so that you felt at once infinite and infinitesimal? To know a constellation, then, was to face not only one's immensity and one's insignificance, it was to know the vista that participated in its membering. It was to befriend the creatures that swirled in its cosmic dance. It was to know its story. This knowing had been so intuitive to my father that he had taken it for granted as a child until he got the scholarship to the Catholic mission school and was beaten out of him with books and Euclid's straight lines and Father Pius Schambach. He was enthralled by the empiricism of the ancient Greek astronomers. Time no longer ebbed and flowed like a river, but became discrete and linear. He found he could chart his day without paying heed to the stars or the moon's voyage across the skies or the seasonal migration of the birds. Occasionally, while deep in the throes of some linear math problem of Euclidean geometry, he would be startled by the piquant smell of gardenias invading his nostrils or the rust-colored hills thrusting their nipples into the sky's blue mouth in the distance. And then the moment would dissipate, and the world would become a thing again, merely filled with other things. Thank you.
Let's talk about your books. Congratulations to all of you. I wanted to begin by talking about genre. Although you have all three won this year's Science and Literature Prize, each of your books is in a distinct literary genre. My understanding is that that's how this prize works. Somebody is a poet, somebody is a nonfiction writer, somebody is a fiction writer. And I think that's really interesting because you're approaching science from different modes of storytelling. This year, in Nobuyo's case, fiction, in Arthur's poetry, and in Brad's creative nonfiction. Many people would describe you as creative writers rather than science writers, and I admire so much about this prize that it collapses the distinction between who is a humanities person as opposed to who is a STEM person. But could each of you tell us a little bit about what inspired your book? And also why the genre you work in feels like the appropriate mode of storytelling for you? Maybe we'll start with you, Brad.
Okay. So the book came out of, like 20 years ago, chancing upon, in the randomness of the internet, just like a couple of paragraphs from Beebe's book, Half Mile Down, which I mentioned in that excerpt, where he talks about coming up from the deep ocean for the first time and kind of emerging back out into the light of that Bermuda afternoon, which became the first chapter of the book. And he says something which I remembered as, "I saw a blue so blue that the yellow of the sun will never be the same." And that lodged itself in my imagination. However, when I went back to find that line, it was not. It was something different. But But so this idea of the deep ocean as a kind of transformative crucible, just the idea that you go down and you come back and you're forever changed. And so that I just lived with as an idea for decades. And then at some point I had to write a book. I don't know, somehow it kept with me. And then when a friend of mine was introduced me to the illustrations that are part of the book, that are the expedition artists that were brought to do sketches of, because they sent these people down to see species that nobody had ever seen before, especially not in their natural habitat, and there was no way to photograph them at that point. And so they brought sketch artists to render them based on the descriptions of the scientists, and these images are amazing. And so that it started to open up just the richness of the book. And I had never written a nonfiction book before. I had written a couple of novels and some other weird things, but like that, this was my first. I've worked as a journalist, as a reporter, as an essayist, but I had never written a nonfiction book. It somehow just seemed like there were so many ways to approach, and the book is made out of narrative, but it's also made out of like language experiments, and it's a lot about just like letting an archive determine what kind of comes into play and following threads and see where they go. And yeah, so the form came out of that process.
Arthur, I realize the inspiration question for you maybe should be slightly reframed, because your book is a collection of prior books. So maybe you could speak more generally about inspiration in terms of the scientific elements that we have woven in, and also, why poetry? Why poetry as a means of storytelling for you?
In terms of why poetry, I feel like it's a blessing and a curse, because everything I write ends up compressing into a poem. Once I tried writing a short story and I started cutting, and after I'd finished cutting, I thought to myself, it's really a prose poem. And once I've tried writing longer dramatic pieces, and they've been cut down, and it's really, it's a poem in a monologue form. So I came to my craft of writing poetry through studying ancient Chinese poetry, classical Tang Dynasty poetry. And those poems are so compressed. And I think I was so amazed at how much could be said with so few words that really became a source of inspiration for me. And in terms of how science and inspiration and poetry work together, I guess I want to say, we had talked earlier about possibly talking about research, but I want to say that in my own experience, I have a science background. My parents wanted me as a Chinese American to be a chemical engineer, and I took a sharp turn and pursued poetry instead. But I had that scientific knowledge and background. And in the early 1980s in Santa Fe, I just by chance or good luck became friends with three renowned particle physicists: Murray Gell-Mann, George Zweig, and Richard Slansky, who was the director of the T Division, the Theoretical Physics Division at Los Alamos. And I would have conversations with them. So I wasn't, say, particularly researching science, but George Zweig, I remember, once said to me, the great question of particle physics is, where does matter end and space begin? And you think there's an atom and that's solid, and then it's hollow, and you think the nucleus is solid, and then it's hollow, and you think the proton is solid, and then it's hollow, and it's like this infinite regress. And so conversations with scientists became very influential with me in an organic, spontaneous way. And the other thing I'll share about George Zweig was he once told me he wrote all of his discoveries. It came about because he was actually at a local grocery store in Santa Fe, and he saw a butcher pull a sheet of paper and tear it off and wrap up some steaks, and he thought, that's what I want. I want that roll of unending paper to experiment and play with. And he did all of his great breakthroughs in science instead of on like 8.5 by 11 sheets on this one continuous scroll where he could just keep riffing. And I love that as a metaphor. As a poet, I'm constantly playing with language. I have a very strong sense of visual images that are important to me, but I try not to know too soon where the poem is going. And as that poem evolves, it's open to experimentation, to bringing in science as a kind of framework to see the world, and to deepen the poem.
Novuyo, it comes to you. Why fiction as a container for the storytelling you do, and also tell us a little bit about the science in this book. Yeah.
Yeah, so the science came about from trying to figure out a simple question: what happens when we die? And death is central to this book. What happens? And I grew up in a Christian household, but I really started looking up and really wondering, what's up there, right? Where is heaven? And that really set me off on my journey in astronomy, just sort of figuring out the layers and going backwards towards the Big Bang Theory. And then, reading up about astronomy, and I remember I was visiting observatories. I became quite the science nerd, and my partner became annoyed because I needed to share this with someone else. I came across the quantum particle, and then it became this, the quantum particle has given and continues to give scientists headaches. It's not even a particle, it's a force field, it's energy. And that was so fascinating to me, this idea of science dealing with the unknown, right, and metaphor, but also science as this, astronomy in particular, as this field that could give us the most precise metaphor for who and what we are. And I was humbled by that idea, not certain knowledge, but metaphor. And of course, in writing, we deal with metaphors. So I immediately saw those in conversation, that astronomy could help me hone and give ever more precise metaphors for the things that my characters are dealing with. But then also, though astronomy is transcendental, it's also very messy, right? It's been used to enlighten and oppress. And so for me, that entanglement was also very good for the sort of tensions, the world building, the conflicts that characters inhabit. And then through my research on astronomy, I became humbled when I realized there's such a thing as indigenous astronomy. I had never thought about that. And I was so inspired by North American indigenous scientists' work, and it made me look back to Africa's knowledge in a new light. I had never really thought about our knowledge, this idea of our stories about the night sky as science. But Robin Wall Kimera's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, actually gave me a scientific method that I used to go back and look at our own knowledge. And suddenly, that came alive. And then you start to realize the global nature of science, that it's a global enterprise, that the need to understand who we are, the need to understand our world, is something every culture has grappled with and continues to grapple with. So that was really exciting.
My next question has to do with method and research, actually. You just referred to Braiding Sweetgrass, a book that I love teaching at City College in a climate writing class that I teach. Really opens minds. But let's maybe each of you tell us a little bit more about how you've conducted research. Arthur, you talked about already relationships with scientists, perhaps more than, maybe that is a way of doing research. Conversation and relationships. And also, yeah, if you care to talk about the specific branches of science that interest you, you've touched on this a little already, Novuyo, but let's hear a little bit more about your methods of research.
Should I start again? So having come across this passage which I mentioned, I had written from time to time just kind of fictionalizations of just this idea of this scientist, and kind of imagined the world that he lived in and relationships that he had. And then at some point, when I was a grad student, not long ago, I went to grad school pretty recently, and I was in a class on medieval literature, and another student introduced herself as a science historian. Her name's Catherine McLeod, a science historian who was working on she mentioned a group of mid-century scientists who, among other things, did the first deep ocean dives. I was like, you're talking about Beebe. I had just written a story about this. She was like, yeah, Beebe. And so she and the the archivists from the Wildlife Conservation Society in the Bronx were putting together a show at the Drawing Center in the Bronx of the illustrations of Elsie Bostelman, and so that was where I first had a chance to see them. And then they invited me up to see the archive, and then so you go up to the Bronx Zoo, and where the in the administrative building, like near the sea lions, you go down into the basement, and there's an old safe, and where they used to keep stacks of cash to pay the staff, and now it's like an archive, and they have all of this stuff from 100 years of the zoo, and it's amazing. And so there were, all of these documents, letters, illustrations, drawings, random newspaper clippings. And I had never really worked in an archive in that way before. And so to just spend days and weeks down there and discovering story upon story upon story, and then discovering that all of Beebe's journals and his personal stuff is in the Princeton Library, and Gloria Hollister, who was also one of the main scientists on the dives, her stuff was in the Library of Congress, and it was just like it grew and grew, and so it became really just about swimming in those archives for several years. And I had this strange situation where I found myself in the middle of lockdown, like isolated, and I had scanned all of this stuff, so I was just like sitting for months, like going through my hard drive, and that was the process, basically. Yeah.
I think for me, research, it can never come first. As a poet, I'm really just playing with language, and one of the things I tend to do as a poet is, if I've been writing poems for 4 or 5 months, to lay them out on the floor and look at certain patterns and see if there's certain recurrences or obsessions, and sometimes I'll think, oh, I've overused this phrase or that image. But in one particular case, the one I want to share with you this evening, I laid out poems that I'd written over like 5 or 6 months, and I noticed the image of the ginkgo leaf was repeating. And as a junior high school kid, I remember collecting leaves from trees all over the neighborhood. This was in Garden City on Long Island, and being fascinated by shapes of leaves. And when I noticed that the ginkgo leaf had appeared in a number of poems, then I started to research it. And I discovered that in terms of its botany, it has what's called dichotomous venation. The first stem splits into two, and then each half splits, and they keep repeating so that it creates the fan-like shape of the ginkgo leaf. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then I discovered it's a living fossil, that it's ancient and one of the earliest known trees in existence. And as I further researched, I was blown away to discover that after the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, there was a ginkgo tree that actually survived and blossomed. And I thought, what an amazing statement that is. And when I came upon that, I felt like this is really important. This is something deep that I need to work with, and I can orchestrate the structure to a book. And in that particular book, The Ginkgo Light, I was writing it after I had taught for 22 years at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And I asked myself, what is that first stem, the beginning, metaphorically? Rosa was talking about metaphor. We're all after metaphor, I think. And I was thinking about what is that first stem, that initial impulse. And because I had just finished teaching for 22 years at the Institute, I wrote out, just by chance, by play, the names of 30 Native American students who were really, I felt like it was a gift and privilege to have taught them. And almost all of them are currently poets today. And I wrote their names out, and I thought, that's too literal. You know, that's what can I do? And I thought at the Institute at graduation, it's customary to name the tribe that each Native student belongs to. And then suddenly it was like, that's it. I'll substitute the tribes for each student, and it'll be a roll call, and it'll be a naming, and it will have no before or after to sort of tell a reader what's going on, but that naming is the beginning of this book, and it'll be in the center of that book.
So one thing I love about scientists is that they write these books for the general public. So they'll explain their work in the language that we all understand. So that's how I got into my research. These nonfiction books by science people, and they're talking to us, the public. And I loved how they were accessible. They were explaining complex things in a language I could understand. There's The Smallest Light in the Universe. It's a memoir by the astrophysicist Sarah Seeger. I think it's about exoplanets. So that's how I became fascinated about extrasolar planets, planets that exist outside our solar system. And then I went researching on that. And then there's the theoretical physicist Chanda Prescott Weinstein. I think she's the first black full professor, theoretical physicist. She does great work, and she wrote nonfiction memoir, The Disordered Cosmos. And I came across, that racially charged potent molecule melanin, right? And she's asking these questions about melanin and what it means to us. And suddenly I'm thinking about melanin. What can it be used to do in space to protect scientists from UV light? How does melanin move in our own societies, right? The history of race in America. Then, of course, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. That's a book I literally just picked up randomly. It was actually in my partner's house, Alexia, and I just saw this book. I started reading it. I couldn't put it down. And suddenly I realized, science is not just white. It's not just white and male. There's actually such a thing called indigenous science. So then that led me on a journey researching, finding out what this is. And so from Robin Wall Kimmerer, I think suddenly I was thinking about, because she writes about science, but she also writes about the disposition of lands, North America, culture. It's a really beautiful book. And there you start to see how science is entwined in a society's beliefs and philosophy. Science is not just universal, right? The method and practice is something we use across, right, the modern method, but it also depends on the society. So suddenly I use that method to look back back in Southern Africa. So for example, one interesting thing, the Khoisan, right? They call them the wildebeest stars, right? I'm like, why are they called wildebeest stars? And these are questions I was asking after I'd read Braiding Sweetgrass, and I'm trying to apply her logic. And so you go back and you realize the wildebeest stars appear in the Southern Hemisphere in December, when wildebeest across the region, right? They flock to Southern Africa, they're in search of water, they give birth around that time. And it was a powerful moment because then you start to think about this metaphor, this symbiosis of sky and land, right? How the story is told. The sky is used to track what's happening on Earth. And then what's happening with the wildebeest right now, right? Thanks to colonial borders, thanks to climate change, right? They're failing, right, to migrate, right? They're dwindling, like the North American bison. They're becoming extinct, right? And that's something that scientific practice, that language is attuned to, right? A language and a way of thinking of metaphor and how we observe the world that's attuned to all these elements. And so that's one of my questions, right? What can such a language do? How can it help us as we think about our universal human scientific heritage? What do we owe one another? What do we owe our universe? So that's sort of where those questions stem from. So I could not have written this book without that knowledge. And so that was the exciting part. Why fiction? Because fiction, I think, does exactly what science does. Who are we? What makes us human? And those questions are not always beautiful. It's beautiful to ask the question, but working through the difficulties of history, of the histories that have formed us, and of the future that we're trying to build, right? So those two came together. For me, science was just a beautiful way of giving fresh answers to old questions, to age-old questions.
Well, Novuyo and Arthur, you've anticipated my next question in many ways, but I wonder if you have anything more to add about how indigenous traditions play a part in your work. Arthur, as you mentioned, you're a professor emeritus at the Institute of American Indian Arts, so why don't we start with you? Anything more you want to say?
I think teaching for 22 years with Native students was really influential and crucial in terms of my own development as a poet. And I'll just mention language, for instance. One of the things I had the privilege to do at the Institute was create my own classes, and I created a class called The Poetic Image that made Native American students look at a classical ancient Chinese poem, and I would go through the poem character by character, and I would show like 4 or 5 translations in English, and we would talk about it. And then, to my surprise, Native students said, well, wait a minute, I'm going to try and translate this into Mohawk. I'm going to translate this into Diné, into Navajo. I'm going to translate this into Lakota. And then suddenly it was like, well, wait a minute, our sense of tense or language or worldview this is going to be a little hard to do. I can create it into that native language, but then I'll have to try and translate it into English, and that'll be such a loss. And so, you know, I discovered that, for instance, Hopi has male and female languages. It was endless, the sort of possibilities of language, the way of looking at the world, and their knowledge of different traditions, say, picking native plants, using them as dye plants for weavings, and creating different patterns, and the idea of the Navajo weaver who always leaves an imperfection into an otherwise perfect weaving, and that sense of humility. And I felt like I was just learning every week that I was working with Native peoples, because I was discovering and having, through conversation, a wonderful sense of learning some of that Native language and knowledge.
So, when I discovered this knowledge, indigenous astronomy, I decided to put just various characters in an enclosed space. This is a graduate program, and so the sort of campus novel or the campus space is really good in that it allows people who would maybe ordinarily interact to interact. And so one thing I actually hadn't seen and thought about is in the sort of the immigrant novel, if you have, say, African characters coming from the continent, I hadn't seen them interact with indigenous characters in North America, and I thought, what would that be like? And that was, so for me, it was important to remain true to my first person narrator, Tando's POV, someone who really doesn't know much about North America or that history. And then she interacted with various characters. There's Shaniqua, who's Afro-Choctaw. And one of the beauties of crafting her was she's in this program and she's practicing indigenous science, melding it with modern science. And this also speaks to the cross-cultural pollination of knowledge. Then we have Mausi, who's from the Hopi Reservation. I tried learning Hopi. It was difficult to sort of find where can I learn, who can teach me this language. I was trying to understand the basics of the language so that I could understand the history of Hopi astronomy. So that was also a pleasure, but also frustrating. And this is where you start to read about in-depth Native American history, the history of disposition. And suddenly it's something that came into my radar as an author, something that was not really in my radar as an African writer. And so what was really, for me, I guess, humbling was to have these Native American characters shown through Atando's limited point of view. So that was very important. So these are the politics of how you write the characters you write. And so I figured if characters can come to America and interact with white characters, with Black American characters, then I can do the job of making them interact with Native American characters and working through the politics and the difficulty of interacting with that history, particularly with Shaniqua, who's Afro-Choctaw, and so has a relationship to the continent that Atandwa does not understand. So there's just a lot of tension there. And so that's how I used, for me, indigenous knowledge in the book. And I won't spoil the ending. Something happens in the end where the characters come together, and you'll have to read to find out what happens.
Brad, could you tell us a little bit about the illustrations? We saw a few of them on the screen as you were reading, and you talked about discovering them, but they're really stunning. These uncanny creatures that live beyond the sun. They're just gorgeous in your book. I wondered if you could talk about the design build of the book and why it was important for you to incorporate so many visuals to tell this story.
Yeah, so something that struck me when I started to look into this archive. One of the things that struck me is that there is two scientists. Gloria Hollister is on the deck of the ship, and Beebe is inside the bathysphere, and they're speaking through a telephone, and he is looking out into the deep ocean and describing to her what he sees, and she's there with a notebook on her lap, like writing down what he says. And those notebooks were there. They were in the Drawing Center exhibit, and they're archived up in the Bronx. And so, on one hand, you have this physical, record of an encounter with the unknown, and so much of the language is her writing down him saying that that what he's seeing is beyond language. And there's so much of it that is just about the failure of language. In the moment, as he is seeing and witnessing, he is in cognitive overwhelm. And so then when I found out about these images, portraying, so there's one thing of like how the deep ocean is like going to outer space, but it's not, in the sense that these first trips into the deep ocean came back with like a whole lot of new creatures that are right next to us, and that became part of the world, and yet the inability to photograph them. And so how would that happen? So then the ability of Elsie Bosselman and George Swanson and the artists who were brought along on the expedition and rendered these images, they're just so striking. I mean, on one hand, they are accurate. They're recognizable as I mean, this is just so fantastic. This is the contents of a stomach, that becomes this beautiful formal construction. I mean, each one is just amazing, so how can you not? I mean, to me, it was just like, they're so fabulous. I mean, I felt like so much of so the book that I had written previous to this was a novel, and so one of the experiences of like giving myself completely to nonfiction, where the contents of the archive and the evidence became a creative constraint, and it changed my relationship to what I was doing. So much of it was just like offering to people what I had found, just being like, look at this, just like, it's so fantastic. And so it became like, that was so simple to want to do that in a way. And so then it was just a matter of having the good luck that Astra House was able to make this book as beautiful as it is. That was, to me, was like, I was crying when I first saw it. It's just how I dreamed. It was amazing. So, but there was a conversation when we signed the contract to make a beautiful object. Like, that was part of the idea. And I feel like that so much of the book is about different ways that language and knowledge and form interrelate. And so to include these, which are about, reaching, to the end of what's known and perceivable, these are, these creatures that no one ever saw again, so they don't know if they were just mistakes or if they are just, the ocean is so vast and unknown that we've never encountered them again, which is entirely possible. So anyway, I could go on.
It's a beautiful book indeed. We're getting to the end of time. I just have two last questions, which maybe we can handle briefly. But another thing I found very beautiful is the title of your book, Novuyo, Digging Stars. Can you tell us just very briefly about the title of your novel? In the Times Review, Weike Wang writes, The Digging Stars is a star cluster known by many names. It is most commonly called the Pleiades. Depending on who and where you are, it's also referred to as the Seven Sisters or Isi Limela, among other things. But no matter its name, in Novoyo Rosa Schumann's excellent new novel, Digging Stars, the cluster is a force, a symbol, a family heirloom. I wondered, as I read, if you had a personal attachment to this constellation, and maybe just briefly how it serves, in particular, this constellation as a metaphor in the book.
Wow. That's a question for like a literature course, like the metaphor. I don't know if authors think that deeply, but I'll tell you. So Digging Stars is a translation of Isilimela, which is the name amongst the Ndebele people in Zimbabwe. And digging, it's used to track when to plow. And it's also used to track the end of the winter season, depending on where it's in the sky, and then also the beginning of the summer, right, the rainy season. So in the novel, for me, the Digging Stars, the title refers to the fact that most of the names, if not all the constellation names in the novel, are named using the Ndebele names, or there's one constellation that uses Anishinaabe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that indigenous name properly. But for me, it had to do with also this idea of knowledge also being global. When we grew up knowing the Greek names, even in Zimbabwe, modern science globally teaches those names. And so for me, to use those indigenous names is to reclaim the night sky, but also in a modern sense, not in the sense of in ancient times. In these times, right, this night sky belongs to us. It also connects, for me, this knowledge to modern science, right? And so for me, globalizes modern science as something that all cultures can then take part in because they understand that it's part of their heritage, right? So before, I thought of astronomy as Western, it's Greek. My culture has nothing to teach me. So that's where that name comes from. Yeah.
Reclamation, thank you. All right, last question for you, Arthur. In the jacket copy of this collected volume, we learn you began your career writing compressed lyrical poems influenced by classical Chinese poetry and later made a leap into powerful polysemous sequences, honing a distinct stylistic signature that harnesses luminous particulars and is sharply focused, emotionally resonant, and structurally complex. And we know your work fuses elements of Chinese and Japanese, Native American, and Western experimental traditions with some really startling juxtapositions that are all deeply informed by concern for our endangered planet and troubled species. The book spans 5 decades, including 10 previous poetry collections and 26 new poems. Looking back over your long career, I don't know how you're going to answer this briefly. What sparked your concern for our endangered planet and troubled species, and how has your concern evolved over the last half-century?
I think it's ongoing. What can I say? I think the sense of endangered planet, of climate crisis, of, it's one of the many crises that we face, is something that grew over time, and it was never like, oh, this is an idea and now I'm going to like develop it or expound it, or it was, maybe I'll try and personalize it and say, for instance, I'm a mushroom hunter in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and so here's mycology where I first wanted to learn mushrooms and I couldn't understand them in a field guide, or they just didn't look like the pictures that were in the field guide. And so for 5 summers I studied with the head of the New Mexico Poison Control, and I was in his group of mushroom foragers, and we went out every Saturday morning and we collected whatever we could find, and we would lay them out on picnic tables, and he would say, oh, this is poisonous, but you need to know it. It's an amanita. It's a panther amanita, and this is an incredible chanterelle. You should go home and eat it. You'll love it. And, but over time, like over 20 years of mushroom hunting, I would notice the effects of climate change. I would go up to the ski basin and suddenly I would think, okay, the rainy season in Santa Fe used to be 6 weeks long, and then it was 5, and then it's 4, and now it's compressed into 3, and there's almost like this urgency of botany when the summer rains do, if they do come in, there's this incredible sort of fruiting of all kinds of mushrooms. And then over time I would think, well, the ones I knew in the beginning 20 years ago weren't coming up because of drought. Maybe they got eradicated, they got eliminated, and other ones persisted. And so that sense of urgency in climate change, I think, was gradual. It was never like, okay, here, this is important, I need to address it. It was more like, if you pay attention to the environment you're living in, I personally draw a lot from nature. You can begin to see those changes happening just over the seasons. And it kept sort of developing in my poetry. So one piece from a sequence in the String Diamond starts deltoid spurge, red wolf, ocelot, green blossom, pearly mussel, razorback sucker, wireweed. There's a list with no commentary, and if you look carefully, it turns out all of those 30 species are endangered species. And I thought, well, this is a beautiful way poetry can communicate that fragility, that precariousness, and that urgency. But if I were to say something, you know, like these are endangered species, that's just bracketing the experience. And if I trust the images, if I trust the plants, the botany, and let the litany, let the sound and the rhythm as a poet make a reader experience that, a reader can say at the end of hearing these 30 names, wait a minute, what is going on? And then, to me, it becomes incredibly fresh and moving. It's part of what poetry does. It makes us more vulnerable and open to life, to experiences we might have thought we were shut off by or didn't have the opportunity to experience. And then suddenly we're looking at how we're all connected and how endangered our planet is.
Thank you. We've come to the end of our program. I want to thank all three of you for sharing your work tonight. Thank you to the Sloan Foundation, the Cooper Union, and of course the National Book Foundation, and our audience for being so engaged. Thank you.